Okay, so we're coming to our final unit, Unit 30, which covers from basically the first decade of the new millennium, actually. I'll include a couple of things to present day, but focuses mainly on the years 2000 to 2010. So while Americans were excitingly ushering in a new millennium, not just the end of a century, but a brand new millennium, nicknamed around the time as Y2K. The unit kind of focuses on a lot of the demographics. What did the nation look like in 2000? And it's kind of an interesting look as we look back at the other two turns of the century in our nation's history, 1900 and 1800, as a kind of a contrasting element to 2000. First of all, the population of the United States in 2000 was close to 300 million, making it the third most populated nation on earth behind China and India in 2000. Also, ethnic division, the country was still 75% white, or those who identified themselves as white, which would be, technically the various European ethnic groups that came to this nation. California was the most populated state in the country in 2000, and Wyoming was the least populated. The largest cities in the country in 2000 were the biggest, number 1, New York City, number 2, Los Angeles, and number 3, Chicago. Now, I kind of mentioned the other two turns of the century in our nation's history. In a significant shift from the beginning of the 1900s, 80% of the population in 2000 lived in metropolitan areas of more than 600,000 inhabitants. So if we take a look, for example, of the area where we live, here where I live, in the Detroit metropolitan area, that would be an example of such an area. 80% of the nation lived in those metropolitan or urban centered areas of the country. So we were definitely no longer the agrarian society that Thomas Jefferson had envisioned around the turn of the 1800s, the first turn of the century in our nation's history. We were definitely a metropolitan, more urban-like society by 2000. The economy was booming in 2000. Remember, in 1900, we were starting to ascend to a pretty prosperous and dominant role economically in the world. Well, we were at the top of the world by 2000. Our gross domestic product was $10 trillion. Gross domestic product, or GDP, is basically a measurement that economists use on the monetary value of all the things combined produced within the nation. And we were at the top of that. And we had been helped by, a century of industry, definitely the good position we were left after World War II. And then in the 1990s, the expanding digital economy, the dot-com revolution. So a lot of different factors to make us kind of the strongest economic power by 2000. And if we look at the demographics of faith and religion in the country, the single largest religious group in 2000 were Roman Catholics. But overall, religious identity was on the decline and has remained so today. Fewer and fewer Americans identifying with specific religious groups. The decade began with quite an election. The presidential election of 2000 was one of the most intriguing elections in history. The choices for president in 2000 for America was, on one hand, a continuation of the Clinton legacy for the Democrats, with Vice President Al Gore, Clinton's vice president, from Tennessee, representing the Democrats, and another Bush, George W. Bush, the son of the former president George H.W. Bush, running on the Republican side. The results were one of the closest elections in history. Gore actually won the popular vote slightly over Bush, but our nation, it's not the popular vote winner that becomes president, it's the Electoral College, a system that was set up by our forefathers in the Constitution to give the individual states more of a say over just the majority of a population in choosing the president. When we formulated the Constitution, we did so with the willingness of individual, really autonomous states giving up that autonomy. And so there were some concessions made to individual states, and one of those was the Electoral College. And the system has stuck to this day in how we choose the president. And again, it emphasizes each individual state over the majority of the population, which, if you did the latter, would definitely favor the most populated centers in our country, like a California or a New York. So in 2000, the Electoral College was in dispute, actually, after the election night. And it all came down to the state of Florida. Florida was so close in determining a winner between Gore and Bush that there was a recount that was called, and then that led to even more recounts that were called based on just a lot of things. The state of ballots in Florida, they would use ballots that were had what were called dingling chads, where you actually had to imprint or kind of poke out dots or whatever the voting machines would do. And then in some cases it was like they weren't, all done specifically or perfectly. And so there was questions on, who is that vote for, and having to determine that. Eventually, the Republican-controlled state government in Florida said, enough's enough. We can go back and forth in this all we want. We're going to go with basically our initial count findings from the recount and declare Bush the winner. Now, the Democrats challenged this and still felt like it wasn't clear that Bush had won the state, and took it through the courts, and eventually our Supreme Court took up the whole decision and ruled in favor of Florida sanctioning George W. Bush as the new president. And that gave him the election. So technically it was the Supreme Court decision that gave Bush ultimately the presidency, which, if they had not done that and allowed more recounts, who knows eventually, what Florida would have decided, and if Gore, in fact, may have been president. On September 11th, 2001, we would have experienced a national tragedy that would forever change our nation when a successful, coordinated terrorist attack was carried out against us. The mastermind behind it was the radical Islamic leader Osama bin Laden. He had a terrorist network that was named Al-Qaeda, and bin Laden planned and successfully carried out for 4 American passenger planes to be simultaneously hijacked on September 11th. And then the plan was, once those planes were hijacked in the air, to crash them into either highly populated and or symbolic American places. 3 of the 4 planes achieved the plan. 2 of the planes hit the World Trade Center in New York City, and you could see really this kind of ominous picture on the slide of where one plane has already hit one of the Twin Towers, and the other one is just about to hit the second one. The World Trade Center was one of the most visibly recognized skyscrapers in the New York City landscape. That's why they were kind of called the Twin Towers. So they were very noticeable as they were twin towers, and they were visible from afar. And they were also symbolically important as the offices of just countless corporations from throughout the world that they would use as their headquarters in New York. So it had kind of a symbol of American business prowess, which was also important to bin Laden to attack. The impact of the planes in New York City would create a chain reaction in which both skyscrapers would come crashing down to the ground, and over 2,600 lives were lost in New York City as a result of those two planes. A third plane was successfully crashed into the Pentagon. Now, the Pentagon is in Washington, D.C., and it's the headquarters of our nation's military. So to bin Laden and to al-Qaeda, this was, again, an important symbolic thing to attack the American military, which they felt oppressed Muslims worldwide, was favorable, for example, to Israel from within the Middle East. And they did successfully crash into the Pentagon, and 125 lives were lost there. The fourth plane didn't quite achieve its goal. It was later believed that its intended target was the Capitol building, or where Congress was would meet in Washington, D.C. Possibly, some had said maybe it was headed for the White House. But it was forced by the rebellious passengers who started to get word of these other planes that had hit from loved ones on the ground and such. They kind of figured out what was going on and forced the hijackers to crash before they made it to Washington, D.C. Unfortunately, it caused the death of all those on board, so 44 individuals lost their lives, but who knows how many they saved by trying to commandeer the plane back from the hijackers. These events initially helped to unify our nation in mourning and a determination to fight terrorists. President Bush would respond to the findings of the investigation of the terrorist act of 9/11 by initiating war against two nations. One, Afghanistan, which was beyond a doubt the home base of al-Qaeda and bin Laden. And then more controversially, he also attacked Iraq later in 2003, which he thought to be a destabilizing force and home to weapons of mass destruction that were theorized to be accessible to terrorists. So Bush, even himself, had a hard time explaining and convincing the nation that Iraq was directly involved with the attacks, where Afghanistan, it was pretty apparent. There wasn't a lot of backlash to our attacking them. But Iraq would kind of plague him through his presidencies because of really just the unclear connection with 9/11 and Iraq. He definitely would get a lot of backlash and a lot of controversy from Democrats and liberals who would really just kind of pound on this, and they do so in the 2004 election and will continue to do so even through his second term in the presidency.